My husband spent 5 years threatening divorce every time he didn't get his way. Yesterday, I finally gave him exactly what he keeps threatening. When people ask why I didn't leave sooner, I never know how to answer without sounding like I'm exaggerating or making excuses. The truth is simpler and uglier. Divorce didn't start as a real thing in our marriage. It started as a word, a lever, a threat that worked so well, it slowly rewired how I lived. We'd been married 3 years when he said it the first time. We weren't even fighting, not really. It was one of those low-level arguments couples have after work, where everyone's tired and slightly annoyed. I honestly don't even remember what set him off. What I remember is the way he said it. Well, maybe we shouldn't be married then. No yelling, no slammed doors, just flat, casual, like he was commenting on the weather. I froze. I remember standing there thinking I'd misheard him. We hadn't talked about divorce before, not seriously. We'd talked about kids, vacations, saving for a house. Divorce felt like something that happened to other people, not something you casually toss into a Tuesday night argument. I immediately went into panic mode. I apologized. For what? I don't even know. I started explaining myself, backtracking, promising I'd do better. He watched me do it with this calm expression, like he was waiting for the right moment to end the conversation. Eventually, he sighed and said, "I don't actually want a divorce. I just get frustrated when you don't listen." I felt relief so strong it made me dizzy. I remember hugging him and thanking him for giving us another chance, which sounds insane now, but felt normal then. That was the moment the pattern locked in. I didn't know it yet, but I just learned the rules. Over the next 2 years, that sentence became his favorite shortcut. Anytime we disagreed, anytime I pushed back, anytime I didn't immediately fall in line, he'd pull it out. Sometimes dressed up, sometimes blunt. If this is how you're going to be, maybe we should rethink this marriage. This is why relationships don't last. I don't know if I can stay married to someone like that. At first, it still devastated me every time. My chest would tighten, my hands would shake, my brain would start racing through worst-case scenarios. I'd picture packing boxes, calling my parents, explaining to people why my marriage failed. The fear made me pliable. That's what he learned. And once he learned it worked, he used it everywhere. The thing people don't always understand is that it wasn't constant yelling or chaos. It was quiet, controlled. He wasn't storming out or throwing things. He was calmly placing divorce on the table and waiting for me to scramble to remove it. By year 4, I was managing my entire life around not triggering that word. I learned which topics were dangerous: money, his job, anything that suggested he might need to change or compromise. I learned how to phrase things as questions instead of statements, how to swallow irritation before it reached my face, how to apologize preemptively, just in case. It sounds dramatic when I write it out, but it didn't feel dramatic at the time. It felt like maintenance, like this was just what marriage looked like. Everyone makes adjustments, right? Everyone picks their battles. The problem is, when divorce is always the nuclear option, every disagreement feels like a battle you can't afford to lose. He'd say it over small things, too, which messed with my head even more. If the threat comes during screaming matches, at least your brain can categorize it as said in anger. But he'd drop it into normal conversations, completely deadpan. Well, if this is such a big issue for you, maybe we shouldn't be together. I don't know if I want to stay married to someone who thinks like that. Then, if I reacted, cried, got upset, tried to talk about how hurtful it was, he'd accuse me of being dramatic. I didn't say I wanted a divorce. You're putting words in my mouth. You take everything so seriously. I'm allowed to express frustration. That part is important because it kept me stuck. He always left himself an exit. If I panicked, I was overreacting. If I stayed calm, he'd escalate. Either way, the responsibility landed on me to fix it. Somewhere along the line, the fear turned into numbness. Not all at once. Slowly. I stopped crying immediately. Then I stopped arguing back. Then I stopped bringing things up at all. I also stopped imagining a future. That was the weirdest change, and I didn't notice it until much later. I stopped thinking about 5-year plans or long-term goals because in the back of my mind, the marriage always felt temporary, conditional, like it could be revoked at any moment. People talk about walking on eggshells, and I used to think that phrase was overused, but that's exactly what it felt like, except the eggshells weren't loud or obvious. They were invisible. I never knew which step would crack them. By year 5 of this, divorce wasn't a shock anymore. It was background noise. He'd say it, I'd feel that familiar drop in my stomach, and then I'd go straight into damage control mode. Apologize, agree, let it go. What I didn't realize was that something else was happening at the same time. Every time he threatened to leave, a small part of me detached, a tiny thread snapping. I didn't feel it breaking, but it was. And here's the part that matters, the part that explains everything that came later. When someone threatens to leave you often enough, you eventually stop hearing it as a warning and start hearing it as information. Not yet, not fully, but the seed was planted. Divorce stopped being an unthinkable catastrophe and started becoming a concept, a process, something real people do with paperwork and timelines and rules. At the time, I didn't act on that thought. I shoved it down and kept doing what I'd always done, kept the peace, made myself smaller, told myself this was just how he communicated. But that was the beginning of the end, even if neither of us knew it yet. Because once divorce became a word he used casually, it stopped being something I was afraid to look at. Once divorce became part of our everyday vocabulary, it changed the shape of my life in ways that were hard to explain to anyone who wasn't living inside it. It wasn't just about arguments anymore. It was about anticipation. I started making decisions based on what might provoke him, not what made sense or what I wanted. I didn't even realize how automatic it had become until much later. I filtered everything. What I said, how I said it, when I said it. If something bothered me, I'd run it through this internal checklist first. Is this worth potentially ending my marriage over? Most of the time, the answer was no, so I swallowed it. Money was a big one. We both worked, but he earned more, and he made sure I felt that imbalance. Any suggestion about budgeting, saving, or not buying something immediately would trigger his tone shift. Not yelling, just that cool, detached voice that meant he was about to escalate. If you don't trust my judgment, maybe we shouldn't be married. So I stopped bringing it up. I quietly adjusted my own spending instead. I paid for things myself, even when it didn't make sense, just to avoid a conversation that could turn into another existential threat. Social plans became tricky too. If I wanted to visit my sister, I framed it carefully. If I wanted a quiet weekend instead of whatever event he'd committed us to, I prepared myself for pushback. Supporting his career, his image, his schedule always came first. Anything that suggested my needs might interfere with that was treated like a character flaw. The worst part was how normal it all started to feel. I didn't tell people what was happening, not because I was protecting him, at least not consciously, but because it sounded ridiculous out loud. How do you explain that your husband threatens divorce over tone, timing, or preference? How do you explain that it's not dramatic enough to be obvious abuse, but not healthy enough to ignore? The first time someone else really saw it was with my friend Emma. She was over one afternoon, just hanging out, nothing serious. I had a migraine, the kind that makes light feel sharp, and my husband came home talking about his boss's party that night. I said, carefully, that I probably couldn't make it. I even added that he should still go, that I didn't want him to miss it. He didn't hesitate. If you can't support my career, he said right there in front of her, maybe we should reconsider this relationship. The room went quiet. Emma looked at him, then at me, like she was waiting for a punchline. I felt that familiar rush of panic, mixed with embarrassment this time. I immediately backtracked, said I'd take medication, said I'd be fine, said it wasn't a big deal. He nodded, sat aside, and went to change his shirt. Emma didn't say anything until later, when we were alone. She asked very carefully, "Does he talk to you like that a lot?" I laughed it off, literally laughed. I said he was just stressed, that he didn't mean it like it sounded. That was my script by then. She didn't argue, but she looked unsettled. That look stuck with me longer than the conversation. By then, my reactions had shifted again. I didn't cry as much. I didn't beg. I just complied faster. That scared me more than the earlier panic ever had. Around that time, we had our anniversary. I'd spent the entire day preparing. I cooked his favorite meal from scratch, set the table, lit candles. I was trying, desperately, to remind both of us that we were still a couple, that this marriage still mattered. He came home late. No text, no apology. When I asked where he'd been, he sighed like I was inconveniencing him. I was thinking, he said, about whether I even want to come home to someone this needy. Maybe we should just end this. On our anniversary, surrounded by candles I'd lit for him. Something in me just shut down. I didn't argue, I didn't ask him to clarify, I didn't cry, I just turned off the stove and went to bed. That was the night I realized how tired I was. Not tired like I needed sleep, tired like I didn't have the energy to be afraid anymore. The threats didn't hit the same way. They still hurt, but they felt duller, like pressing on a bruise instead of fresh skin. I started noticing other things too. How often he positioned himself as the one who could leave, while I was the one who had to earn staying. How disagreements never ended with compromise, only with my surrender. How he never actually packed a bag, never took a concrete step toward leaving, just kept the idea hovering over me. At the same time, the logistics of my life felt increasingly fragile. Our finances were partially joint, partially separate, in a way that worked fine on paper, but made me uneasy. My name was on some things, not on others. If he actually followed through on his threats, I wasn't even sure what would happen, where I'd go, how quickly things could unravel. Those thoughts scared me, so I pushed them away. I told myself I was being paranoid, dramatic, just like he said. But something fundamental had changed. I no longer felt like we were building something together. It felt like I was renting stability on a month-to-month lease, and he could evict me whenever he felt annoyed enough. By the end of that year, divorce wasn't a bomb anymore. It was a button, one he pressed whenever he wanted control. And without realizing it, I was getting closer to pressing it myself, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. The argument itself wasn't dramatic. That's the part that still surprises people when I tell this story. It was my birthday. Not a milestone one, not a big party situation. I wasn't expecting anything extravagant. A card, a happy birthday, maybe dinner, something that acknowledged I existed. He forgot, completely. I didn't bring it up right away. I waited until that evening, until we were both home, because I didn't want to seem petty. I told him calmly. I even framed it gently, like it was an easy mistake to fix. He didn't apologize. He rolled his eyes. "You know I've been busy," he said. "Do we really need to make a big deal out of this?" I said, and this was a mistake apparently, that it hurt my feelings, that I felt invisible sometimes. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't raise my voice. I just said how I felt. That was enough. "If you're going to be like this about everything," he said, already sounding bored, "I want a divorce." There it was, delivered like muscle memory. Something in me clicked into place. Not emotionally, practically. The fear didn't come. The panic didn't come. I just felt still. "Okay," I said. He laughed, a short, dismissive laugh. "Don't be ridiculous. You know I don't mean it." "No," I said. "I mean it. We should." The shift in his expression was immediate. Confusion first, then irritation, then something that looked like unease. He started backtracking. Stress, work. He didn't mean it like that. Why was I jumping to extremes? This was just how he talked when he was frustrated. I listened. For the first time in years, I didn't interrupt him. I didn't defend myself. I didn't reassure him. I just listened and noticed something important. He sounded scared. That night, after he went to bed, I stayed up on my phone. I didn't Google how to save your marriage. I Googled divorce process. I didn't even know what I was looking for. I just needed facts, structure, something solid to replace years of emotional whiplash. What I found was boring, and that was oddly comforting. Divorce wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was steps, filing, disclosure, timelines, forms. There were waiting periods. There were rules about finances and property. It wasn't about who cried the most or who said what in an argument. It was procedural. I read about legal separation versus divorce, about joint accounts and individual accounts, about the importance of documentation, about how verbal threats don't mean much legally unless there's a pattern. That word stuck with me. Pattern. I opened my notes app and almost without thinking started typing dates, just rough at first, months where he threatened to leave, situations I could remember clearly. I didn't embellish, I didn't vent, I just wrote what was said and why. I stopped when I realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from clarity. This wasn't a marriage problem, this was a leverage problem. Over the next few days, I didn't tell him what I was doing. There was no announcement, no confrontation. I went to work, I made dinner, I responded to him the same way I always had. He seemed relieved, like the moment had passed and the threat had worked like it always did. But it hadn't. I started paying attention to logistics instead of tone. I checked which bills came from which accounts. I looked at our lease. I quietly made copies of important documents and emailed them to myself. Not because I was planning to leave immediately, but because I finally understood how exposed I was. I also noticed how often he still used the word divorce, offhand, careless. And each time he did, something in me hardened. I didn't argue, I didn't escalate, I just filed it away. Date, reason, exact phrasing, like evidence, not ammunition. I realized something else during that week. He assumed divorce was a threat because he assumed I was too afraid to accept it. He had never once considered that I might hear it and take it at face value. That assumption was his blind spot. By the end of the week, I knew two things with certainty. First, that this marriage couldn't be fixed with better communication or more patience. And second, that if I was going to leave, I needed to do it quietly and correctly. Not to punish him, not to scare him, but because for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't reacting to his words anymore. I was preparing for their consequences. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing at first. Not my friends, not my family, and definitely not him. Once I'd made the decision to take his words seriously, I understood that the most dangerous moment wasn't leaving, it was letting him know I was thinking about it. So I kept my routine the same. On the surface, nothing changed. I went to work, I cooked dinner, I asked him how his day was. He kept using the same tone, the same casual threats, and I kept responding the same way I always had, or at least he thought I did. Internally, everything was different. The first concrete step was scheduling a consultation with a divorce lawyer. I took a long lunch break and sat in my car outside the office, hands sweating on the steering wheel before I went in. Part of me still felt like I was doing something wrong, like I was betraying him just by asking questions. That guilt was deeply ingrained by then. The lawyer was calm in a way I immediately trusted. No dramatics, no pushing. She asked factual questions and took notes. How long had we been married? 8 years. Any children? No. Assets? Mixed. Has he threatened divorce before? Frequently. Has he ever followed through? No. When I described how often he used the word, her expression didn't change, but she did pause. That's not a communication style, she said. That's leverage. She explained the process slowly, step by step. Filing didn't mean things were over immediately. There were timelines, there were opportunities for mediation if both parties wanted it. But the most important thing she emphasized was preparation. People who use threats usually don't expect consequences, she said, which means when they come, they react badly. Quiet planning protects you. She advised me to document everything going forward. Dates, exact phrasing, context, not to confront him about it, not to warn him, just to keep records. If local law allowed it, she said, recordings could be helpful, not for court theatrics, but to shut down gaslighting later. We talked finances next. That part was sobering. She explained the difference between marital and individual assets, how joint accounts worked, and what I was legally entitled to. She told me to open a separate account in my own name and start diverting my paycheck there. Not hiding money, just protecting access. If he controls the narrative, she said, he'll try to control the resources too. I left the office with a checklist and a sense of gravity I hadn't felt before. This wasn't an emotional decision anymore. It was administrative. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked through that list quietly. I opened a new bank account and changed my direct deposit. I paid my share of joint bills consistently so there was a clear record. I gathered documents, tax returns, insurance policies, account statements. I scanned everything and stored it securely. I didn't rush. Rushing leads to mistakes. I also started looking for an apartment. Not something dramatic or symbolic, just a small, safe place I could afford on my own. Somewhere boring, somewhere stable. Every showing I went to felt surreal. I'd sit in empty rooms imagining my furniture, my routines, my life without constant tension. The thought didn't make me sad the way I expected. It made me breathe easier. At home, he kept playing the same game. He'd make an offhand comment about how relationships don't work when people don't compromise, or how he didn't know if he could stay married to someone who made everything difficult. He expected the usual reactions: reassurance, apology, panic. Instead, I gave him neutral responses. You might be right. I hear you. Okay. He mistook my calm for submission. I could see it in the way he relaxed afterward, in the way he smirked like he'd won something. That smugness hardened my resolve more than any argument ever had. The lawyer suggested one more thing before filing: timing. She said, file when you're ready to leave, not before. Filing escalates things. You want your exit lined up. So I waited. I packed slowly, one box at a time. Nothing obvious. I told him I was reorganizing. I labeled boxes with vague terms like books and winter clothes. Each box felt less like a loss and more like a boundary. I also started recording, exactly as advised. Not constantly, not secretly setting traps, just when he used that word again. Divorce. Casually, carelessly. I didn't argue back. I didn't explain why I was recording. I just let him speak. By the time everything was in place, the apartment, the finances, the paperwork, I wasn't nervous anymore. I was steady. That's how I knew it was time, because fear had kept me married for years, and clarity was about to set me free. By the time everything was ready, the strangest part wasn't the secrecy, it was how little he noticed. I'd expected him to sense something, a shift in my mood, a change in my behavior, but he didn't. Or maybe he did and dismissed it, the same way he dismissed every sign that I was reaching my limit. To him, nothing was wrong. The system still worked. He kept using the same lines, the same tone. Divorce floated into conversations like punctuation. If you're gonna make a big deal out of this, maybe we should just get divorced. I don't know how long I can stay married to someone like you. Each time I gave him what he thought was compliance. You might be right. I said it calmly, no edge, no sarcasm, and every time his shoulders relaxed. He thought he'd won. He didn't realize that my agreement wasn't surrender, it was acceptance. Behind the scenes, the timeline was moving forward. The lawyer drafted the paperwork. She walked me through it page by page so I knew exactly what I was signing and what it meant. Petition for dissolution, financial disclosures, temporary orders. None of it was emotional. It was specific. Names, dates, addresses. She explained that once filed, the process existed independently of either of us. He could be angry, he could refuse to read it, he could tear up the copies. None of that would stop the clock. I scheduled the filing for a Friday morning, not for drama, for logistics. It gave me the weekend to move without having to juggle work, and it reduced the chance of an immediate confrontation spiraling into something unsafe. The night before, he threatened divorce again. I don't even remember why. Laundry, maybe? Something small and forgettable. I said, okay. He smiled. That smile stayed with me longer than the threat did. The next morning, I finalized everything. The lawyer filed electronically, confirmed receipt, and sent me copies. Real ones, stamped, dated, with court information. I packed the last of my things while he was in the shower. Not in a rush, just efficiently. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. I left the place clean. I wasn't trying to make a statement. When he came out and saw the boxes stacked by the door, he laughed. Wow, he said. What is this, another dramatic phase? I handed him the envelope. He didn't open it right away. He waved it off, still amused. What, are you trying to scare me now? No, I said. I'm moving out. The smile faded, just slightly. He opened the envelope, watched his eyes scan the first page. I could see the moment when the words stopped being abstract and started being real. He looked up at me, confused. This is crazy, he said. We can work this out. I never wanted this. I didn't argue. I pulled out my phone. The lawyer had suggested this too, not as a threat, but as a reality check. I played the recordings, not all of them, just a few, dated, clear. Divorce because of groceries, divorce because of laundry, divorce because I disagreed with him. His face changed with each one, smug to confused, confused to alarmed. That's not what I meant, he said. That's just how I talk when I'm frustrated. I nodded. You've asked for a divorce hundreds of times. I'm just agreeing. He started to panic then, tried to negotiate, promised change, said he'd never say it again. He reached for the papers and tried to rip them in half. "It doesn't matter," I said, calmly. "Those are copies. The real ones are filed." That's when it hit him. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't a tactic. It wasn't something he could talk his way out of. He followed me from room to room while I grabbed my bag, alternating between begging and anger, accusing me of throwing everything away, saying I was heartless, saying I was overreacting. I didn't engage. There was nothing left to explain. As I was driving to my new apartment, my phone buzzed. One message after another. Apologies, promises, declarations of love. 40 texts by the time I reached my apartment door. I didn't respond. Because for 5 years, he'd treated divorce like a weapon. And now that it was finally real, I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I was free. I didn't feel relief the way I thought I would when I finally left. There was no cinematic moment, no deep exhale as I drove away. What I felt was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a constant noise stops and your body hasn't caught up yet. The apartment was small and plain and perfect. I slept on a mattress on the floor the first night, surrounded by boxes. And for the first time in years, I slept all the way through without waking up to that low-grade anxiety humming in my chest. No texts, no arguments replaying in my head. Just sleep. The legal process kept moving, whether I thought about it or not. That was the part I hadn't fully appreciated until I was on the other side of it. Once the paperwork was filed, it existed outside of us. His emotions didn't slow it down. His regrets didn't reverse it. He tried, of course. At first, the messages were apologetic, long paragraphs about how he'd been stressed, how he didn't realize how much his words hurt, how he'd never threatened divorce again. He framed it as a misunderstanding, like we'd both been equally confused. Then they turned angry. He accused me of blindsiding him, of being cruel, of destroying our marriage over nothing. He said no normal person would end a relationship without trying harder to fix it. He said I owed him a chance. I didn't respond. The lawyer had been very clear about that. Once you file, communication should be limited, factual, and preferably in writing or handled through counsel. Not because you're being cold, but because emotions muddy facts, and facts are what matter now. We switched to email, short messages, logistics only, property pickup times, account closures, no commentary. There was something strangely empowering about that. For years, he'd controlled conversations by escalating them emotionally. Now, emotion didn't buy him anything. The court dates were unglamorous. Zoom calls, forms reviewed, deadlines set. Nothing dramatic, no speeches, just procedure. At one point, he tried to argue that he never really wanted a divorce, that he'd just been venting. The mediator asked how often he'd said it. He didn't have an answer. I did. Dates, context, pattern. The conversation moved on. That was when I realized something important. I hadn't overreacted. I hadn't been dramatic. I'd responded proportionally to years of being told explicitly that our marriage was disposable. A few weeks after I moved out, I went back to the house with a friend to pick up the last of my things. He wasn't there. I was grateful for that. Walking through those rooms felt strange, like visiting a place I used to live in a long time ago. Nothing in the house had changed. Same furniture, same photos, same walls that had heard the same word over and over again. Divorce. It didn't scare me anymore. When people hear this story, they sometimes ask if I ever miss him. The honest answer is that I miss who I thought I was married to. I miss the version of the relationship where love wasn't conditional and commitment wasn't used as leverage. I don't miss living on edge. I don't miss bargaining for stability. I don't miss feeling like my place in my own marriage was temporary. The last message he sent me was weeks after everything was already in motion. It said he'd changed, that he finally understood, that he'd never threaten something like that again. I didn't reply. Because change that only shows up when consequences arrive isn't change, it's panic. For 5 years, he asked for a divorce every time he didn't get his way. Eventually, I stopped being afraid of the word and started listening to it. I gave him exactly what he kept asking for, and I walked away knowing that choosing myself wasn't dramatic, cruel, or impulsive. It was overdue.